Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Skip podcast. Before we get into today's topic, which is one of my favorite topics, I want to take a step back. I mean, we've done about a dozen episodes of the Skip podcast, and I've really enjoyed both creating it as well as getting comments from many of these listeners like yourself who are product managers in their tech career or even outside of product management trying to get ahead. And I've really been experimenting with the newsletter on Substack and the podcast. And one of the things I found is, unlike other podcasters out there who are really good at finding guests and interviewing them and getting content, I think the lane that I'm going to start focusing more of my time on is sort of the 30-minute coaching session. My hope is that I pick a topic that's representative of the questions I get during the week and during the month on people coming to me around career questions, how to think about how to manage effectively, how to get ahead in their career, how to make job transitions, and just sort of simulate what it's like to spend half an hour with me. I can't, certainly find time with all of you as much as I would like. It's just increasingly been difficult to scale that. And so this podcast is kind of a substitute. And my hope is that it's like us going for a walk and us taking a topic over the course of the summer and the remainder of the year. I'm going to try this new format. So again, thanks for your feedback. Hope that this format works for you. And, let's get into today's topic. And today's topic is actually an offshoot of one of the discussions I had a couple episodes ago around this transition that people are starting to make from manager to IC. And the note that I had made is that, hey, it's actually a positive transition for potentially you and your career, and certainly a positive transition for the industry as we're getting more and more focused on building products, more hands-on than growing and scaling organizations. And so if there's a choice between building the Tesla or building the factory to generate the Teslas, I think, during growth mode, we were all around, we need to create a factory to have as many ideas in our company out there as possible. And now it's like, let's get the one or two to really stick. And that means that there's been a lot more focus on ICs. And I talked about there's lots of different skills that ICs tend to have, particularly in product management. There are almost 6 completely distinct skills that exist to tackle the 6 types of ambiguities that exist inside of companies. I think I've come up with these 6 primarily because I started seeing some of the same questions over the last decade. It started out with simple questions like, how does one become more senior? And my answer was, master these skills. But it's also the answer when I hear, why is Sally leveled higher than Elaine? Or I've been working here for a long time. Shouldn't I be promoted? Or I'm pretty sure to be a leader, I need to start managing as many people as I can. Or how is it possible that person crushed the interview, but then they did so poorly in the role that we had? These all seem like completely different styles of questions. But I think by the end of the episode, you'll realize that actually they all have to do with the skill mix of the individual and what their superpowers are. And it really is nice to have this vocabulary around these ambiguities that exist in the workplace and the skills you need to master. So the other reason I like using this set of skills is to answer the question of what's the biggest problem that I can give you. Now, I use this as my sort of normalizing question to determine seniority. Now, if you have to compare 2 different leaders and, you look at their backgrounds, you look at their LinkedIn, you look at maybe the answers to interview questions, the thing that I'm always asking myself is how big of a problem can I hand this person? And then for them to solve it with as little assistance as possible. Now, I don't mean that they'll go solve it and I never have to talk to them again, but it means that they'll surface exactly the right things at the right time and they'll own and manage the other pieces. And the bigger the problem, the more ambiguous it is. And the more ambiguous it is, the harder it is to solve. And so leadership, to some extent, is getting your skills such that you can solve a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. And if you think about it, some of these CEOs of tech companies, the problem they're given is to sort of take a successful product and expand it by, making $1 trillion company a $2 trillion company, or taking a product that's globally used in building a second one, these are really hard problems. I mean, these are industry-shattering type problems. So when then confronted with this leadership question, I tend to break it down and I say, well, the person will be good at these skills, but perhaps not as good as these other skills. And I need some framework, which is why I use these 6 ambiguities. I also feel like these ambiguities should start to show up, and they probably already do, in your promotion ladder. And so these aren't alien to what it takes to get promoted. They're actually all suggesting the same thing. But as an industry, we don't have a common language here, which is why I hope that all of you start to say, oh, yeah, I can see these skills, how different they are, and how the peers that I have different skills, and how this coming together gives us these large problems that we can solve. Okay? Now, without further ado, let me first introduce the 6 ambiguities. So the first one is product ambiguity, then growth ambiguity, domain ambiguity, market ambiguity, organization, and team. So if you go back, and I'll use now skills, is that I'm looking for people to have strength or skills in developing and solving product, growth, domains, markets, organizations, and team. And if you're concluding things correctly, you'll basically see 2 very specific things. One is you will realize that these 6 things are very different from one another. And you'll realize that it's almost impossible or inhuman to be experts at all of these. So our goal is to build strength or superpowers in a few of these. But before we get into how we use this to shape career, let's first define each one individually. Okay, let's start with the first one, product ambiguity. Product is such a big and vague word. I want to start defining it relatively quickly here. So I think that in consumer or end user companies, there is a challenge around figuring out how to get new things off the ground or how to add new features to an existing product. And often in these consumer companies, you have to be a crafter. You have to be opinionated. You have to understand the mission of the company, the user base, the research of how people are using it, and you have to just come up with great product ideas. Now, you might say that isn't that what all product managers do? And the answer is, as we get through these skills, the answer is not really. But at crafters, and I've been fortunate to work with some of the best crafters in my career, those crafters are very connected to the product design, product research teams. They tend to be very into the weeds, into the pixels, into the details. They live, breathe the product. They're the ones that have 20 apps on their phone. They crush the product sense interviews at the company. They're very opinionated on how to improve products. And they think a lot about like the core features that would make the product really scale, really get to the next level. They tend to be the most into the details on the product, but they tend to be very focused on how the product will change from a feature point of view. Now, they may not be able to deliver the product, but their concepts, their ideas, the prototypes, the mission, the vision of what they're trying to do are unsurpassed. And I think most early stage companies have founders that tend to have this characteristic. And then as a company gets later, you always tend to find 1 or 2 folks who are in product management who have the most opinion on where the product needs to go. And those are your product crafters. That's the first skill, this product crafting, that we want to ensure you understand. Okay, the second area that is challenging for companies is to figure out growth. And this is different than the features that they want to deliver. This is how to take a product that's starting to go and actually grow it to the next level. Interestingly, on the surface, you think, well, isn't that just a person who's opinionated on the features to add? And the answer is actually no. This person is much more into the data and the dashboards and the funnel of how consumers or users are taking advantage of the product. They understand the math behind not only the business, but the acquisition and usage of the product. And then they know how to change and tweak the product, the marketing, and the system underneath to ensure that the product continues to see growth on a very predictable and very consistent basis. Now, companies that are very early stage don't need this because they're more trying to craft and find product market fit. But once you are at that first sign of smoke where things are starting to work, you need growth product managers. You need folks that are really experts at this. And most companies that are at mid-stage and late stage have growth organizations. And in some of those organizations, the growth PMs are very different than the sort of traditional product generalists, the product managers. And in some, they collapse the two and they just sort of create a specialty. But you would find that a growth PM would actually do potentially quite poorly in a crafter interview. Product sense is not their strength, but product growth is. So the question you would ask them is, well, what would the dashboard look like to manage my product? And they would know the goals, the metrics. In fact, they spend as much time with the data science team and the analytics team as maybe the product crafters do with the product design and the user research team. And so such a distinction, but both are called product managers, but two radically different skills. And I think now over the last half dozen years, we have seen growth product management become its own entity. It was maybe first we started to see that at Facebook, which had tremendous experience and expertise in building growth from their product management capacity. And now it's essentially common in almost all organizations. Okay, the third type of product manager tends to have domain expertise. They tend to navigate domain ambiguity inside of an organization. What do we mean by domain? Examples are things like AI and ML, hardware product managers, people that are skilled in semiconductors or infrastructure or enterprise security or Web3, right? These folks, often the businesses that are in these areas tend to have lots of domain-specific challenges. And experts that really know security like the back of their hand have just a leg up. They join a company after they've worked in security for maybe half a dozen or a dozen years, possibly at multiple settings, and they're able to hit the ground running. In fact, if the team that one has is mostly generalist PMs that have a mishmash of skills, some of these specialists are dramatically helpful. And so I tend to see domain, at all different levels of company, but you tend to see them more on enterprise where you're not looking at consumer whims. You're looking at these businesses that are very detailed and deep. And those B2B companies look for a lot of domain experts, and they tend to have technical backgrounds. So oftentimes you'll see an ex-engineer turned product manager have depth in, shall we call it, infrastructure, security, or ML, or Web3. And their career plan is they started in an area of depth, they stayed in that area of depth, and they ended up building an expertise that then they harvest in future positions. Now, the reason why I think that this is worth pointing out is that it is in high contrast to the first two areas that we mentioned, where crafters might actually come from product design or user research as background, and they became product managers and leaders. And then growth PMs might have come more from a data science or a growth marketing background. In this case, this is a natural starting point for engineers. And again, very different skill set than the first two, but equally critical for companies that are just starting to go, because often when they just start to go, they don't have a lot of experts And it's incredibly additive to bring a few folks who have done this before, even if they're not as familiar with the company, because they can scale the organization so much more effectively, given they have the playbook already of where the business is going. The fourth skill is navigating market ambiguity. So most businesses have complex competitive landscapes, and the person or people who are skilled at being able to understand the market, not just from a domain point of view, but just a industry point of view, see what the white spaces look like. Where does LinkedIn need to go? Where does eBay need to go? What are the vulnerable places for a Google or a Meta or a Amazon? How is Web3 unfolding? What does AI plus education look like? Folks that have a deep skill in markets can understand these industries, where they're going, and then articulate what are the product bets that would be most effective. Now, sometimes they're not full-time employees, they're consultants. Sometimes they become VCs or live as VCs, and they don't become product managers. In some cases, they have been consultants in the past, and then they join companies, and this is the skill they bring. And in the interview, they come across incredibly strategic and very, very thoughtful. And I think that the challenge with this particular experience is that if you're skilled in this area, if you aren't skilled in one of the other areas, the three previous I mentioned are very hands-on, then it's a hard role for a product manager to essentially live on their market experience. Because, you and I both know that, companies need to pick a direction, and that is important. But then once they do, it's mostly around execution and less around the notion of strategy. And so if someone is very strong in this arena, perhaps there's strategy product managers. And in very large organizations, particularly in non-tech, they have strategy business areas that come in and understand and look at the overall landscape for their product line and for their industries and provide feedback. And they're almost like internal consultants for the industry. But I point this out because these folks tend to do incredibly well during certain styles of interviews. If you're asking a question like, let's say AI is a staple and eBay was disrupted, what might have happened? Unlike all the other experts we've talked about, these folks are going to crush it. And a lot of interviews have these types of questions because they want to know that the person is quote unquote strategic. But the challenge of being hands-on is oftentimes profound because to be very good in the strategy means you may not find it interesting or you may not have the experience in running detailed execution. And so that's the cautionary tale, but it's an important archetype and it's an important skill to identify because we'll all encounter these folks in the workplace. Okay, this fifth area is the organizational ambiguity that PMs need to navigate to deliver on complex projects. And what's interesting about organizational ambiguity is that most PMs start doing basic project management in their career. And in fact, a lot of PMs that have strength here were project managers prior to becoming PMs. So unlike data science or design or engineering, which we've identified in the priors, or even management consultants, this particular industry specialist, this organizational expert, tends to be project managers. And when you start out, you're project managing, but then when companies become complex because they have multiple products, they then have multiple business units. And those multiple business units have their own goals. And I think if you work at big tech or any large scale organizations, you immediately recognize that, the company wants to prioritize doing some big thing. and it needs to work across multiple areas of the business. But often those areas are in conflict with one another, and there are people who are experts at managing this conflict, building alignment, and ensuring that these projects get out the door. And the reason why this is important is that this internal ambiguity exists on these projects almost as profound or even more profound than the product ambiguity that a 0 to 1 project might entail. Said another way, oftentimes people assume product management is hard because it's hard to come up with the features for the product. But actually, once a project starts to go, you have lots of data, lots of users, lots of expertise around the table, but the complexity of the organization increases for every feature, every product line. Products are quite easy to articulate. And in fact, many of you know, I think Google should do this, or I think this mid-stage Shopify should do that, or Salesforce should do this other thing. Photoshop should just do this one thing. But then you realize that internally, getting the simple things done are incredibly difficult. And so this inside the building ambiguity is essentially solved through experts who know how to frame up projects, build process around this, identify when things are in conflict, and then bring them to the right leaders to make decisions and determine when leaders are not making decisions and hold them accountable. And this is a very common super IC role. At Meta, we call these folks captains, but I think most large organizations have these experts. They may not have a specific title and archetype, but many of them are ICs, or they have very, very small teams, but they're some of the most valuable people to the organization, because to get big things done, if these people don't exist and they don't have the ability to navigate the inside ambiguity as effectively as some of the crafters do or the market folks do for the outside, product wouldn't get it shipped. So that's why this organizational ambiguity is so important, but I think is actually fairly poorly understood unless you've worked in big tech. And even within big tech, you don't quite realize how important this skill is to master to get big things done. So many of these projects, by the way, are company priorities. And so the interview questions that you might expect to have in these is, what's the largest project you've managed? And what drove the priority of it? And how did you resolve conflict? And what process and tools did you employ to make these happen? Now you can start to see that this skill, these ambiguities are so vastly different from a domain expert or someone who knows how to crack the code on a mature market or someone who knows how to craft the next feature or drive growth when a product is starting to go. Totally different skills. The last area of skill is around managing teams. It's the most common one. It's how do you hire people? How do you coach people? How do you manage indirectly? Those that have the skill to be experts in management tend to look at team as the focal point. And as I alluded to earlier in the podcast, I think this is what most people assume is that you come up with good features, they succeed in the marketplace, and then you go manage product managers, and then you become an expert in leadership. I will openly admit this is a requirement for executive leadership. Most executives in companies that are product managers have teams that they manage, and those teams require you to have a skill in knowing when to hold back, knowing when to trust, knowing whom to hire, knowing whom to fire, knowing how to break down a complex project into sub-teams, and then knowing how to partner with sister teams and other functions in order to make this go. Now, some of this is needed in all of the different product management skills we've described, but frankly, the team one is the one that puts this on the display. And it's worth pointing out that to be an effective team builder, you have to know the skills on domain, on crafting, on growth, just enough so that you're able to coach and manage folks. You don't have to be an expert, but you do have to have a fair amount of knowledge, because you wouldn't be able to help pull people forward if you didn't know what to look for, what to value, and how to stay out of the way, quite frankly. Now, as I've stated, I think that it's too myopic to assume that everyone needs to, as quickly as possible, go pick up this skill. I think that we've established there are other skills to be able to identify. But once you are a team manager or team builder, oftentimes you are able to transfer that into other functions and vice versa. So it's common for someone to become a great team builder and then manage non-product management disciplines. Or maybe said a different way, often I see senior leaders in data science, engineering, design, research, and other functions who have been managers actually make a transition to product management when the large amount of the role is around team building, because it is a transferable skill. Managing product managers outside of the core skills that you need to have an understanding of isn't vastly different than managing engineers. And so there is some ability to move once you become managers. So as I think about the kinds of questions that I would want my team builders to be able to answer, they usually fall in the range of management style questions like, how do you empower your team without micromanaging? Is a very common discussion that we tend to have. So, okay, these are the 6 skills. We started talking about product crafting. Then we went to growth. Then we talked about domain and depth. Then we zoomed up and talked about market, organizations, and team. 6 different skills that apply to the product managers out there. So how should you use these? Well, I'll start by saying that they are different, and I think we've established that. Ideally, you would tell me that you are an expert at 1 or 2 of these. And if you're early in career, you have much time to go and focus on being a great crafter, or being a great growth person, or being excellent at managing complex organizations, or perhaps being a great people person and being a great manager. But pick a lane. If you are world class, meaning top 1%, 2% in the industry at 1 or 2 of these areas, you will have an elite career. You will command the highest compensation. You will have the most choice in companies, and you'll be actively sought out. Now, the other way to look at this is to ensure that you're not weak on any one of these. Because I think that if you are weak in one of these areas, it will hold you back. So you want to be average or good at all of these, have an appreciation for the discipline, have point of view on how you would solve, build expertise in each of these lanes. Pick 1 or 2 to be excellent. Don't be deficient in any. If you're expert in one, it'll pull you forward. If you're deficient in any, it will hold you back. But if you're average at all of them, you'll be a generalist and not necessarily distinguished. So specialization is quite critical. And frankly, most of you are naturally going to gravitate towards 1 or 2 of these. So I'm not telling you something that's radically different. I'm giving you permission to lean in, whether it's at your company or your next job, to make sure that when you get to mid-stage of career and you're bumping on that leadership area, you can call on these 1 or 2 areas to push you forward and accelerate you through some of those challenges that exist when leadership roles are few and far between and they go to a couple of really top people. They go to folks that have expertise based on what the company needs. Maybe it's domain, maybe it's 0 to 1 crafting, maybe it's growth. Having that in the back of your hand and being known for it is so helpful to pull you forward in career. Now, in a few cases, you'll hear entrepreneurs that are also very skilled in one of these areas. Now, you can even just start to tell an entrepreneur who's skilled at managing complex organizations it's probably not going to be a great fit because you're in pre-product market fit mode. But if you're great at understanding markets, that's really helpful. If you're a great crafter, even better. If you have domain, you'll be able to see things that others don't see. So you immediately start to pattern match, not just which function exists that are good feeders into the product management discipline, but also how entrepreneurs need to be skilled. And giving vocabulary to this helps you be able to then evaluate how do different people perform in interviews. Now, the crazy part is you wouldn't want to stay to be promoted to be a VP at a late stage company if you want to be an entrepreneur. A couple other things that I would note about these skills is that organizations tend to specialize. Apple's great at crafting. Meta's great at growth. You start to see what different PM organizations have found themselves specializing in the same way that individuals can be very, very strong in one or two areas. It's rare to see all of these areas show up. I love for you to use this language when you interview people. And if they bomb that interview, it could be because they've never worked at scale. And if that's the job you have for them, well, so be it. Maybe you shouldn't hire them. But if you're going to hire someone to create the next product and they happen to be excellent at crafting and domain, but they struggle because they can't manage organizational complexity or they haven't managed large teams before, well, maybe they're exactly who you need. But in the panel of interviews, oftentimes we hear yes, yes, no, no, no. And then we're like, well, we shouldn't hire this person. And, yes, maybe you can hold out, but you want experts in the areas that you need, not necessarily just a broad set of skills. I think individuals need to be experts, but teams need to be diverse rather than individuals being diverse, but then being spread too thin without one or two superpowers. So in conclusion, when someone comes and says, how does someone become more senior? It's go find one or two areas to become experts in this list of ambiguities. If someone comes to me and says, well, why is Sally level higher than Elaine? Then I would look at the list and say, well, maybe Sally is just more accomplished at one of these areas that are important to the company or important to her position. Or I've been working here for a long time. Shouldn't I be promoted? Well, tenure isn't enough. It's have you mastered one or two of these areas? And I need to get a leadership role, so I need to start managing. This is my favorite one to say, well, management, as I've noted, is only one of the six. Sure, you could be a manager and be strong in all of these areas, but being an expert at some of these other areas is probably more career additive than getting into management as quickly as possible. And if you ask why some people ace interviews or some people do well in one team, they don't do well in others, if you ace an interview and you struggle within the job, it's probably because the job's requiring one set of skills and you are maybe experts in another. So matching the needs of the role with the ambiguities that exist to succeed in the role, and then figuring out if you have those skills is kind of the name of the game. And maybe lastly, I'll just say that, hey, I feel like maybe this is a good way for a lot of you who are listening who don't understand product management to understand what are the different components that make this up. And if you're in the product management field, I'm hoping this language is actually going to start creeping in, not just to interview feedback, but to our job ladders, because our job ladders all kind of approximate this. They sort of want managers, they want people who can take these larger and larger problems and solve them. But without the exact detailed language, it's quite hard to understand those pieces. So my hope for those of you listening is that you can now think about your own career and your skills much more effectively. Talk to your managers about what you're trying to acquire, and then pick these lanes to really jumpstart if you're stalled, or really accelerate if you're not, a really meaningful way to get into leadership and beyond. So, been a pleasure. Hope all of you enjoyed today's episode and love to hear from you, your comments and questions on this topic. See you soon.